Hello and welcome to Crossing the 49th, the Cross-Border Tax and Financial Planning Podcast. I'm your host, Phil Hogan, and today we're going to talk about personal cross-border tax deadlines. So when we say personal cross-border tax deadlines, I'm really only talking about deadlines related to your personal tax returns. We're not going to get into corporate deadlines today. This will just be for mainly Americans living in Canada or those thinking of moving. So your actual personal tax deadlines on the Canadian and on the US side as well. So let's get started here. For personal purposes, very generally, so on the Canadian side, we know that our tax returns are due April 30th of the year after the calendar year. And for US purposes, your tax returns are due April 15th. So generally speaking, if possible, it's always great to get those returns filed by those deadlines if you can. The April 15th deadline, of course, is much earlier than the Canadian one. And this conversation is quite timely because we're coming up to the October 15th deadline, the final US deadline to file your US tax returns. And we'll talk a little bit at the end about some options if you're going to miss that October. But of course, whenever possible, we want to file our final return our final US return anyways, by October. But generally speaking, April 30th on the Canadian side, your Canadian T1 return will be due, and April 15th, your US 1040 and all the required forms are due by April 15th. So what extensions are available for both the Canadian and US returns? So let's actually just start with the Canadian. So even barring any cross-border issues, your Canadian tax return will be due April 30th unless you're self-employed or your spouse is self-employed. Then your Canadian tax return will be due on June 15th. So if you or your spouse are self-employed, you have until June 15th to file your return. However, you do have to pay by the 30th or you'll incur interest on any amounts due. Now, for US purposes, if, let's say, you're not a resident of Canada first, there's an opportunity on the 15th or before the 15th of April to file an extension. So if you file an extension via Form 4868, that'll extend your tax return into October 15th of that year. So really important, if you don't think you're going to meet that April 15th deadline, you can further extend your return all the way to October. Now, for Americans that are outside of the US, and we're talking about mainly our clients in this context, living in Canada, you have an automatic extension to file your US return to June 15th already, if you're out of the US on the filing date, which would be April 15th, or sometimes it's April 16th if the deadline falls on a holiday. So just remember that you actually have an automatic extension. I mean, we get this a lot where people might get a little bit panicky coming into April 15th. Even though they're living in Canada, you have that automatic extension to June to file returns. Once again, if you feel like you can get all those returns filed without doing any extensions, that's great too. Earlier the better, not always possible, but if you think you can get all your stuff arranged and get your tax return filed by those dates, that's great as well. But just know that you do have a automatic extension to June 15th. Don't have to do anything for that extension. Now let's talk about what happens if we get to June 15th and we still haven't filed our tax return. So this is where it gets tricky from a cross-border perspective. Rules are different on both sides of the border, of course. Let's just attack the Canadian side for now. So if you're self-employed and you're filing on June 15th, we don't have extensions available to us like they do in the US. So your return will be due June 15th regardless, and you won't receive any additional extensions. So what are your options? I would say, whenever possible, you want to file because you're not really you're not always worried about penalties on late tax owed, which is an issue. There might be forms in the return like a T1135 or T1134 that by itself would have penalties even though tax is not due. So you want to file that return by June 15th if possible. If for some reason you feel like you can't, you would want to make a payment for the amount of tax owed so you don't have that 5% penalty on the amounts owed. So we're not really going to get into the strategies of how to extend a Canadian return because you can't really extend it. You want to file that return by the 15th, and that should give you plenty of time. I mean, that gives you a little bit less than 6 months to actually get that return in. So I wouldn't procrastinate that during tax season. Try to get that Canadian return in by June 15th. Now, the US return is different. So if you have not filed your US return by June 15th, for whatever reason, and you had that automatic extension because you're American living in Canada or out of the US, you can file that form, that 4868 form, which some people might have filed that already, before the deadline or even before the 15th of April. So you're still good till October. So that'll extend it further to October. So you definitely have an option with the US return, not so much on the Canadian side. And then, of course, the FBAR is automatically extended into October. If you read the rules when they talk about FBARs and extension deadlines, they really just talk about the return being due on April 15th. However, there's an automatic extension to October. So essentially that means the FBAR is due in October. I honestly would not push it that far. The FBAR is a good example of a form that doesn't have a ton of integration with the tax return. I mean, there's an 8938, which is similar to the FBAR on the US return. If you can get that FBAR filed during tax time before April 15th, get that one out of the way, get it filed. That's a great strategy. So let's talk about, so we talked about the October 15th deadline. So once you file that 4868, your US return is extended to October 15th. Now, what happens if you get close to October 15th, which I think some people are in this boat right now, where I'm getting emails from people either asking if they know anybody that can help on the tax side, or what their options are if they can't file their US return by October 15th. And this might happen, this happens often because you might not receive forms such as K1s from partnerships, and LLCs might come in much later. So you don't even have access to those forms yet, although most people should have those forms by now. So we're going to talk about a strategy here, but I just want to make this clear. This is not something you want to use every year. You want to use this if you absolutely need to and you have no other option. So there's an opportunity to extend past October 15th to December 15th. But there's no prescribed form for this extension. You actually have to write to the IRS. So once again, you don't want to use this strategy unless you absolutely have to, because it does carry some risk. I would say if you get to October 15th, I would file your FBAR regardless. I wouldn't rely on this extension to extend the FBAR into December. That's just a dangerous thought. So let's not do that. But if you do feel like you can't file a tax return by October 15th, there is an opportunity to request a December 15th extension. And this is how you would complete this. So you would write to the IRS, and I'll put in the notes below, I'll put the address where you need to send this letter. So essentially you complete a short letter where you outline your name, the year for which you're extending. So if you were doing that this year, you're extending for the 2022 tax year, your social security number, and the reason why you are filing this or requesting an extension to December 15th. That reason will probably be different for each of you, but you need to put that reason in there for them to review it. Now, you're not going to get a response from the IRS on this, but if you have a good date stamp and a mail stamp to show eventually, if you needed to, that the return was extended, you'd want to keep that. So once again, we're kind of walking through this quickly on deadlines, but I think it's really important to just really understand the flow of what returns are due when. And I'm going to reiterate this again. Anytime you can just get the returns prepped and get them in to the departments, better. There's no reason to have these hang around in the summer, well into the fall. As we know, most tax accountants are very busy in tax time, and some might push it. Clients might push it into the summer. If you can stay organized, if you can answer the questions that your CPA needs answered, if you can complete those intake forms properly. I know often we're missing slips, and that's not something clients can really control. But the things you can control, I would do. FBARs are a good example. Those are things you could probably get to mid-February and have all the statements, bank statements, and investment statements you would need to complete the FBAR. So I would just sit down, get through those, spend the 1 or 2 hours to compile that information to get those done. That way, the FBAR's out of the way. You don't have to worry about that. So once again, closing thoughts are just this. There's no reason to extend a return all the way to October if you have all the information you need to file the return. So whether you're filing the return yourself, do your best not to procrastinate and just get them done. If you're having somebody help with the returns, a professional, make sure that you're getting them the information they receive. If they, very often what'll happen, we'll collect a bunch of information. We'll see what's missing. There'll be some maybe holes in the returns. We might communicate by email back and forth with the list of questions. Do your best to read through those questions very carefully and answer each one of them as they're being asked, because it's very difficult to get through these returns when we don't get answers to the questions that were kind of outlined in email. Because let's not forget, we all have hundreds of clients. As these emails come through, try to get to them on a first in, first out basis. But it can be tough, especially when we're kind of pushing all the way to October 15th. So do your best to work with your CPA, answer their questions, and that certainly will just get you closer to filing these returns. Just as a point of reference, I would say, half of our clients, or maybe even more, half, they're done by April 15th because they have to file by April 15th. And that's great, because then they don't have to worry about tax returns for the rest of the year. Some clients are, they're in tax return mode or tax season mode all the way to October, which likely would be frustrating. So anytime you can get them in and filed, always a good idea. If you have any questions on this or any other cross-border tax or investment questions, feel free to reach out, Phil at philhogan.com. Would love for you to check out the website, philhogan.com. And you can also reach us on YouTube, where you're likely subscribed. And if you're not subscribed to the channel, make sure I'll leave a link down below to subscribe to the channel, so you'll be alerted once the next video is uploaded to YouTube. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.